Hello, learners. Today we are going to discuss and understand one of the poems which is written by an Indian poet named Kamala Das. And the poem is My Mother at 66. Now, before reading the poem and understanding it, let us know about a little bit about Kamala Das, which would help us in understanding the poem better. So, first of all, she was a poet, one of the most significant Indian poets who wrote in English. And in most of her poems, she expressed personal emotions with honesty. And yes, her poems, the dominating themes of her poems were mostly love, womanhood, about identity, about marriage, about loneliness, family relationships, aging, emotional conflict. Now, what she did was she often transformed these deep and private experiences into universal human concerns. And this poem, titled My Mother at 66, is one such poem. It is personal and moving poem which is about aging, which is about separation. And as the title suggests, it is also about a daughter's fear about of losing her mother. So the poem, uh, uh, it captures a very ordinary moment of life. That is, the poet is traveling from her parents' home to Cochin Airport with her 66-year-old mother sitting by her side. Now, during the journey, she suddenly notices how old, pale, and weak her mother has become. And this sudden observation awakens a childhood fear. The fear, what is that fear? The fear that one day she'll be permanently separated from her mother. So, we'll understand this in much more details while we go further with this video. So, the poem has been written in a very simple language. And yes, if we or as readers, we think of this, we will, this Kamala Das has also evoked an universal anxiety, which is associated with aging, death, separation from our loved ones. So let's move on. Okay, so I have already given you the introduction. Let us also understand the poem before we go into the line-wise reading. Now, I'll explain this briefly. Now, the situation in the poem is very simple. As I had told you, again, I'll repeat it briefly. A daughter is traveling from her parents' home to Cochin Airport with her aging mother. However, it might seem to be an ordinary journey, but beneath this ordinary car journey, um, there is this intense emotional experience that the daughter goes through. As the daughter looks at her sleeping mother, she notices her mother minutely. She notices the signs of physical weakness and old age, which immediately awakens a fear in her. What is that fear about? It is the fear of separation and loss. The poem then moves through a sequence of emotional stages as we read on. There's observation, which creates fear, and there's avoidance, and there's a second look and controlled farewell. So first the daughter observes her mother's pale and lifeless appearance. Next, she feels the painful fear that her mother may not live much longer. And when she is unable to face this thought, she tries to avoid it by looking outside at young trees and cheerful children. And then at the airport, however, she looks at her mother once again and is confronted with the same fear. Finally, uh, she controls her emotions and hides her pain behind that smile. So that is the controlled farewell. Okay, the emotional map of the poem is very important. Now, this emotional map can be divided into three major stages. The first stage is the car journey, during which the poet or the daughter notices her mother sleeping beside her and becomes aware of her physical decline. Now, the second stage is the painful thought, when the mother's pale face reminds the poet of death and makes her realize that separation may be soon approaching. The poet, temporarily pushes this fear, pushes this fear aside by looking at the lively world outside the car. And that is the third stage is the airport farewell. After the security check, the poet looks at her mother from a distance and once again notices her weak and vulnerable face, and her childhood fear of losing her mother once again returns. But this time, instead of expressing her anxiety, she says a goodbye, a hopeful goodbye, and smiles strongly. So, thus, we see that the poem moves from observation to fear, from fear to avoidance, and finally from renewed fear to an emotional control. So the poem begins with these lines: driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning. Okay, so let us understand. As this is a very ordinary situation where Kamala Das tells us that she is traveling by car from her parents' home to Cochin airport on a Friday morning. So the description is very simple, which is of a journey, but the place, we must notice that the place from where she is leaving and the destination towards which she is traveling are emotionally significant. She is leaving her parents' home, a place which is associated with childhood, family, and emotional security. So she is going towards an airport, which is a place of departures, which is a place of separation, which is a place of distance. So there is this idea of separation which has been introduced from the very beginning of the poem. The poet is physically moving away from her mother, but the journey will also make her emotionally aware that a much greater and more permanent separation will occur one day. So, one thing to be noticed is that Kamala Das does not begin with anything dramatic. She begins with a very ordinary, everyday statement. But gradually, as we read on, we'll reveal that this ordinary, beginning to the poem reveals something deeper. Next, the poem reads: I saw my mother beside me doze, open mouth, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Let us understand this. So now the poet turns her attention towards her mother, who is just sitting beside her in the car. And her mother has dozed off. She has slept off, which means she is sleeping lightly. While the poet notices her mother, she notices that her mother's mouth is slightly open as she is sleeping, and she has this natural posture, especially, an elderly person who's tired. But for the daughter, she does not see it merely as an ordinary sleeping position. She notices her mother. She notices her mother very minutely. She notices that her mother is weak. She is tired. She is physically vulnerable. And a person who is asleep cannot control the facial expressions or maintain that elegant appearance or energetic appearance. So therefore, all the signs of the mother's old age becomes very clearly visible to the daughter. And that mother who once looked after and protected her now appears to need protection herself. And that mother who is physically present beside her, the poet begins to sense the possibility of her future absence. So that which begins with a simple observation becomes the starting point of the poet's anxiety about aging, about death, and about separation. Next, the poem reads: ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked. So, you know, um, students, we one thing that we must notice the word ashen. The word ashen is very important. Please follow the text while I am explaining this. The word ashen means pale, gray, something that does not have a healthy color. As the poet looks closely at her mother, she notices that her face has become extremely ashened, that is, pale and lifeless. Now, this appearance reminds her of death. And this comparison with the color ash is disturbing because it reveals the sudden fear that enters into the daughter's mind. She is not saying that her mother is already dead. Of course not. She is saying that the mother's pale and exhausted face makes her think about the possibility of losing her. And at this moment, the poet painfully realizes that her mother is genuinely old. Perhaps we also realize that we have always been seeing our mother as someone strong, dependable figure of our childhood. And children often imagine that their parents will remain unchanged forever. However, once we notice something like this, the visible signs of aging, the poet also is facing the same situation. She's forced to accept that the time has weakened her mother, and this realization causes a kind of emotional pain because old age is not merely a physical condition here. It suggests the that a permanent separation is approaching. Okay, let us continue from the previous line, that she was as old as she looked, but soon put that thought away and looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. But after the airport security check. So let us understand till this part. What is being said here? Let us see. So all of a sudden, after this realization came, the daughter, the poet, avoids this, tries to avoid this painful thought. Um, this, she, after recognizing how old and weak her mother has become, the poet cannot bear to continue looking at her and think about the separation. Therefore, she deliberately pushes the thought away and turns towards the outside world, which is outside the car. Now, this is a kind of emotional avoidance. Now, she does not overcome her fear. She just tries to suppress it temporarily. And students, we have to understand that this is a very natural human reaction. When a truth becomes too painful to confront, we often try to distract ourselves rather than face it directly. So the poet is doing the same. The poet's effort to avoid the thought shows the depth of her love towards her mother. And also, the possibility of losing her mother is so frightening for her that she is not yet prepared to accept it. So she looks outside the car, and that is a method of psychological escape from the anxiety that she is going through. And she continues to look outside, and notices that the car is traveling quickly, and the trees that outside the car appear, they seem to be rushing backwards. She also notices the children, the young children, who are full of energy, freshness, and vitality. So, the merry children spilling out of their homes, but after the airport security check, standing a few yards away. Okay, let us understand what is said about the merry children. Now, when the poet has looked outside through the window of the moving car, she notices that the trees outside appear to be rushing backwards. Actually, in reality, the trees are stationary, but the movement of the car creates the impression that the trees are running, and the trees are described as something young. And also, the poet notices the cheerful children coming out of their homes. Now, these children are active, are excited, and full of life. Now, these images of trees and young children, they create a world of movement, a world of youth and happiness outside the car. You know, they are standing in sharp contrast. These images of children and trees, they are standing in sharp contrast to the poet's mother, who is pale, tired, and almost motionless inside the car. Now we have to notice the contrast here. It is very important. On one side, we have the beginning of life represented by children and young trees. On the other, we have the later stage of life represented by the aging mother. And the outside scene actually is a temporarily distraction of the poet. But yes, of course, it also indirectly reminds her of the difference between youth and the old age. Now, this particular slide is a continuation of the previous slide number 8, where I have already explained how the children stand as images of youth and images of new beginning. I hope there will not be any problem in understanding this. The poet, when she notices the outside scene, and tries to distract herself temporarily, she notices the children who represent freshness, energy, and the contrast that I previously explained, the contrast between the youth and the aging outside outside and inside the car. The two images gives us brings the contrast very nicely. Please take reference from the previous slide explanation. But after the airport security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her wan, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood fear. So let us understand this part. Now, when the poet she finally reached Cochin Airport, the car's journey came to an end. Now she must go through the airport's security check before boarding her flight. So there's this change of setting, which is also again very important. Until this moment, the poet and her mother, they were sitting together inside the same car. Now a physical barrier has already begun to separate them. The security check. The security check actually represents the point beyond which the mother cannot accompany the daughter. And so the airport becomes more than an ordinary location. It becomes a symbol of departure, a symbol of separation, a symbol of distance. So the poet is preparing to leave her mother behind and travel to another place. At the same time, we see the physical farewell also reminds her of the greater separation that she fears, the possibility of losing her mother forever. And there's this emotional tension that rises within her. It increases because departure from the airport is no longer an idea. It's actually about to happen. And then the poet goes on to look back from a distance. After passing through the security check, the poet stands a few yards away from her mother and looks at her once again. So the physical distance between them, it is actually quite small, but emotionally it feels greater. This distance between them symbolizes the separation that is about to increase when the poet boards the aircraft. And yes, the second look is very important. It is more painful than the first because the moment of departure was sitting. Because the moment of departure has now arrived, and inside the car, the mother was sitting close beside her. But here at the airport, she appears alone. She appears vulnerable from a distance. So the poet may also be wondering whether this could be the last time that is seeing her mother. She, even though she is not expressing this directly the uh, through the poem, but the uncertainty is present beneath all this observation. So the small gap of few yards becomes symbolic here. It becomes symbolic of the emotional distance, of the physical departure, and the possibility of a permanent loss. Next, we see in the next few lines, we'll go to the next slide for it. I looked again at her, wan pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache my childhood fear. So, the poet now again uses another simile here to describe her mother. She compares her mother's pale face to a late winter moon. Now, let us understand why this image is so effective here. A late winter moon, if you imagine it, it often appears to be very weak, which has no warmth. It appears to be colorless. It appears to be dim, and of course it has not no warmth, so it does not have the brightness of a full summer moon. So similarly the mother appears faded, weak, drained out of all energy. Now, um, the image of late winter is symbolic because winter is generally associated with decline will and the final stage of the whole seasonal cycle. So late winter suggests that the season is approaching its end, and also as the mother is in the later stage of her life. And however, the comparison is gentle. The comparison first showed the poets, initially when she had this corpse like image. She described her mother sleeping like a corpse. The first comparison showed the poet's sudden shock that is expressed through the word corpse like. Whereas the late winter moon, this comparison expresses a quiet sadness, a tender awareness. The daughter sees her mother as beautiful, as and beloved, but also at the same time, she notices the fragility and that her mother is close to disappearance. That is to be noted here. Now, the last few lines, it says, my childhood's fear, but all I said was, see you soon, Amma. Let us understand these last few lines. So, on seeing her mother and noticing her pale and weak face from a distance, the poet experiences a pain that she describes, that pain she has described as something that is old and something that is familiar. Now, students, this tells us that fear is not new to her, this fear. It has existed within her since childhood. A young child naturally depends upon her mother for love, for protection. Therefore, the thought of being separated from the mother can create this intense fear. So, although the poet Kamala Das, she is now an adult, but the possibility of losing her mother makes her emotionally return to that insecurity of the childhood. And this is why the pain is both old as well as familiar. The fear was probably there, but it remained hidden for years because the mother continued to be present in her life. Now, when the mother is there, but the visible aging brings that fear back to the poet with even more greater force. The poet actually realizes that what she feared as a child may actually eventually become a reality. Now, the final lines of the poem, all I did was smile and smile and smile. So, there's this repeated smile and there's this controlled farewell. So, one word to be noted here is smile. And the moment of farewell had finally arrived. The poet does not tell her mother about her fear. She does not even cry or speak about any of the fears that she is going through. Instead, she says that they will meet again. They'll meet again soon and repeatedly smiles. Now, we see that her words are hopeful, her words are reassuring, even though she cannot be completely certain about the future. So, the repeated smile is very important because it is not a simple expression of happiness. It is actually a mask behind which the poet is hiding her anxiety, her sadness, her helplessness. All she wants a mother to see the confidence rather than fear. She does not wish to make this elderly woman anxious at this moment of departure. And yeah, if why it has been repeated? Of course, she does not. The repetition actually suggests effort. The poet puts in so much of effort to keep smiling because her natural impulse must be to cry. So the smile contains several emotions actually at the same time. There is love for her mother, there is fear of losing her mother, there is also hope, there is courage, there is emotional control. And the poem ends without resolving the fear of loss. It continues. The daughter's smile allows her to live with dignity and to protect her mother from the pain that she herself might be experiencing. Okay, so before concluding, we must understand that the emotional movement of the poem, which began with a very ordinary journey, it gradually developed into a profound fear of loss. The poet first observes her sleeping mother, notices the signs of old age, and is suddenly reminded of death. But yeah, she tries to avoid this thought by looking outside at the youthful trees and the cheerful children. However, the fear again returns at the airport when she sees her mother from a distance. But finally, she controls her emotions and hides them behind a repeated smile. So the poem moves from observation to fear, to avoidance, to renewed awareness and controlled farewell. Kamala thus shows that aging and separation, they are unavoidable, but love often expresses itself not through these not through dramatic words, but through these quiet gestures that we find in this poem, also through the emotional restraint. And yeah, in this particular slide, I have highlighted few of the poetic devices which we had already come across while we were reading and going through the line-wise explanation.